I was 29 the year it happened. It was mid-September 2017 when I took a week off work to spend some time alone in the mountains of Idaho. I needed the break more than I realized. Life back home in Denver had gotten too loud, too fast. I wasn't married, had no kids, and besides a few friends from work, I mostly kept to myself. My job was in software support, which meant long hours at a desk and constantly being connected. I just wanted silence. I booked a remote cabin through an old website someone had recommended to me months earlier. The cabin was listed under a man named Rick, but I never met him. He left a code for the lockbox by email and a vague promise that the place was clean, quiet, and private. The pictures looked old, but I wasn't looking for luxury, just space and quiet. The drive up took nearly 8 hours with stops. By the time I pulled off the dirt road that led up to the cabin, the sun was setting low over the mountains, casting long shadows through the pine trees. The road wasn't marked well. My GPS cut out halfway up, and I relied on a printed map I'd saved as a backup. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, just beyond a narrow trail that snaked off the main road. It was a single-story place, built with thick, dark logs. There was a small porch out front, 2 rocking chairs, and a rusted metal sign above the door that read Keller's Rest. The place looked old but not abandoned. The windows were clean. The woodpile was stacked neatly. I parked beside it, stepped out, and felt the kind of silence I hadn't known in years. Inside, it smelled like dry pine and old leather. There was a single bedroom, a small kitchen with basic supplies, a wood-burning stove, and a fold-out couch. No TV, no Wi-Fi, no cell signal. The nearest neighbor, according to Rick, was about a mile down. But I never saw another house, just woods. The first 2 days were uneventful in the best way. I spent my time hiking the nearby trails, sitting on the porch with a book, or walking down to the little stream behind the cabin to watch the water move. I didn't see a single person, not even a car on the road below. At night, it got colder than I expected, and I started using the wood stove. I got the fire going easily enough, and it heated the place quickly. On the 3rd morning, I woke up around 6 a.m. to use the bathroom. The cabin had plumbing, but the toilet drained into a composting tank behind the place. While walking to the back, I glanced out the window above the sink and noticed something that wasn't there before. About 20 yards from the cabin, near the tree line, was an old wooden shed. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I missed it when I arrived. It was half covered in vines and shadowed by tall pine trees. Still, I was surprised I hadn't noticed it before. It sat on a slight slope, leaning a little to one side, with the roof caved in at one corner. After breakfast, I decided to walk over and check it out. The shed looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood was gray and splintered. The door hung crooked on its hinge. A rusted padlock dangled from the handle, but it wasn't fastened. I gave it a gentle push, and the door swung open with a screech. Inside, it was dark and smelled like mold. There were old tools, rakes, shovels, a broken axe head, leaning against the wall. A couple of crates sat in the back, covered with a tarp. I peeled it back and saw a mix of empty paint cans, rope, and something wrapped in cloth. I didn't bother unwrapping it. Probably more tools. It wasn't interesting, just old. I left the shed door open and walked back to the cabin. That evening, I went out on the porch to watch the sunset. The sky turned gold, then orange, then a deep, burnt red. I looked back toward the shed and noticed the door was closed again. I was sure I'd left it open. I didn't shut it when I walked away earlier, and there wasn't any wind that day. I sat there for a while, staring at it, until the trees swallowed it in darkness. That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't fear exactly, just a steady, gnawing awareness that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Every creak in the wood, every shift in the wind, kept me on edge. Around 1 a.m., I heard something outside. It was soft, slow. Footsteps. I got out of bed and crept to the window. I stayed back in the shadows, careful not to let myself be seen. I stared out into the dark for nearly a minute before I saw movement. Someone was walking from the shed toward the trees. He was tall, thin, dressed in what looked like a heavy jacket. I could only see his outline against the tree line. He didn't have a flashlight. He moved quietly, not like someone who was lost or exploring. He walked like he knew where he was going. I didn't move until I couldn't see him anymore. The next morning, I went to the shed again. The door was locked with the padlock now fastened. I tugged on it, but it was tight. Someone had locked it during the night. I started pacing. My mind went through every possibility. Maybe someone used this shed for hunting supplies or storage. Maybe the owner, Rick, had come by. But then why would he come at night? Why didn't he knock or say anything? Why would he lock the shed without checking on the cabin? I felt something I hadn't felt in years, paranoia. It hit like a sickness. My hands were shaky. My thoughts wouldn't stay still. I went inside, locked the door, and stayed in the cabin for most of the day. I didn't eat much. I barely read. Every sound outside made me flinch. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed in the main room with the lights off, just watching the woods from the window. I kept the fire low and sat with a blanket, eyes locked on the dark patch near the shed. Nothing happened until around 4 a.m. I saw him again. This time, he stood just beyond the shed, facing the cabin. He didn't move, just stood there looking. The dark made it hard to tell, but I could see the faint glint of his eyes. He had no flashlight, no backpack, just a figure standing completely still in the cold. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't make a sound. I just stared back. He stood there for almost 10 minutes. Then, without a word, he walked off into the woods again. I waited until sunrise before stepping outside. I checked the ground near the shed, and sure enough, there were fresh boot prints in the dirt. They were large, wider than mine. I followed them a few feet before they vanished into the pine needles. That was the morning I decided to leave early. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything into my duffel. I didn't care about folding anything. I didn't even finish the food in the fridge. I just wanted out. But when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery connections. I tried jump-starting it with my portable kit. Nothing. It was completely dead. I didn't know enough about engines to diagnose it further. All I knew was that it worked fine when I arrived, and now it was dead. The worst part? No cell signal, no neighbors, and no landline in the cabin. I was stuck. I spent the rest of that day with every curtain drawn, every door locked. I tried to calm myself down, but there was no comfort in that place anymore. I slept on and off through the afternoon, ate a cold can of chili straight from the tin, listened to every creak like it was someone testing the floorboards. That night, I stayed in bed with a knife from the kitchen. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. He was there. I held my breath and didn't move. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. He stopped at the front door. I heard the wood creak under his weight. Then the doorknob moved. He tried it once, twice. Gently. It was locked. I kept it that way. He stood there for what felt like forever. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear anything but the wind outside. Then the footsteps moved away. He didn't run. He just left, walking off like it was nothing. The next morning, I gathered my gear, loaded my backpack, and left on foot. I took the dirt road heading south, following it toward where I thought the nearest town was. I walked for nearly 5 miles before I saw a Forest Service truck. The ranger was kind enough to give me a ride into town. I didn't tell him everything, just that my car had broken down and I needed help. I reported what happened to the local sheriff later that day. They sent someone up. When they reached the cabin, the shed was empty. The crates were gone. No signs of anyone. The only prints were mine and the ranger's. My car had the battery removed. They never found who did it. Rick, the owner, swore no one had permission to be on the property. I never went back. It was the fall of 2018 when I took a trip out to a cabin my uncle used to own, one that had been passed down to me after his death a couple years earlier. He died of a heart attack while walking his dog not far from where the property line meets the edge of an old cemetery. The land is out in West Virginia, up in the mountains, where you lose cell signal about 20 minutes before you even see the first gravel road. I was 28 that year, working a job I hated, drinking too much, and feeling like everything in life was slowly collapsing inward. The cabin sat quiet for years, untouched since my uncle passed. He didn't have kids, and the rest of the family wanted nothing to do with it. When I got the papers in the mail showing the deed was now in my name, I let it sit for months before I even thought about going up there. I wasn't particularly close to him, but I remembered visiting once when I was a kid. He always said it was his retreat from the world. I thought maybe I could use the same thing. I needed a break from the city, from people, from the noise. I wanted to be somewhere I could think. The drive up was uneventful at first. I had an old cooler full of food and drinks, a backpack with clothes, a basic toolkit, and a pump-action shotgun just in case. The roads narrowed the closer I got to the cabin. I passed a few trailers, a junkyard, and 2 small churches before the asphalt ended. After that, it was just gravel and dirt, winding through trees that looked like they hadn't been touched in a decade. When I arrived, the place looked rough. The cabin was still standing, but the front porch sagged. The roof had patches of moss and leaves clumped thick along the gutters, and the windows were cloudy with years of grime. The graveyard sat maybe 200 yards behind it, up on a gentle slope, surrounded by a rusted iron fence. I could just see the top of a few headstones from the edge of the woods. There were maybe 20 or 30 graves total. Some tilted, some cracked, all of them old. I parked the car and stepped out. The air was cooler than I expected, and I smelled wet leaves and old wood. I walked around to the back, checked the foundation, and then unlocked the door. The key still worked. Inside, the cabin had that dry, dusty smell, like books, and wood mixed with the scent of old insulation. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the floor creaked beneath every step I took. The place hadn't been broken into, but time had done its own damage. The first night, I kept things simple. I unpacked, swept the floor, checked the windows, and cleared out a family of mice that had nested inside an old drawer. There was no running water, so I brought in bottles I'd picked up along the way. The power still worked, surprisingly, since the place was connected to a small generator that my uncle had wired into a propane tank system. I didn't trust it long-term, so I stuck with flashlights and candles after dark. I remember sleeping lightly that night, mostly from being in an unfamiliar place. I heard things in the woods, like branches snapping and leaves rustling. Probably deer, I told myself, or raccoons. But even then, something felt off. There was this strange stillness, a quiet that went too deep. I grew up in rural areas. I know the sounds of the woods, but this was different. It was like the air held its breath. The next morning, I made coffee with a camp stove I brought and sat out on the porch. Fog hung low over the trees. I walked around the cabin, checked the little shed out back, and then decided to go look at the graveyard. I didn't feel weird about it then. I just wanted to see what kind of shape it was in. The grass was overgrown, ankle high in most spots, with thorny vines wrapped around the fence posts. There were no names I recognized on the stones, but most of them dated back to the late 1800s and early 1900s. A few small markers indicated children's graves. Some had just initials or years. Others were too weathered to read at all. One large stone near the middle read Sullivan, a name I didn't know. There was no path, no flowers, no signs of upkeep. It was a forgotten place, and standing there made me feel uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. I didn't stay long. I went back to the cabin and spent the day doing small repairs, tightening hinges, cleaning the fireplace, oiling the door locks. I noticed someone had spray painted a strange set of symbols on the inside of one of the shed doors. Faded red paint, maybe 10 inches tall, 3 overlapping shapes I didn't recognize. It was probably nothing. Teenagers. Or maybe my uncle was a weirdo in his final years. But that night, something woke me up. It was just after 2 in the morning. I had fallen asleep on the old couch with a blanket wrapped around me. The fire had burned low. I heard a sound outside, short, quick, like someone dragging their foot through dry leaves. Then it stopped. Then it came again. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, but the beam was weak. I went to the window and looked out toward the tree line. Nothing. Then the sound again, this time from the back. I moved quietly to the rear door and pressed my ear to the wood. The steps were slow and steady. Not an animal, not a deer. I opened the drawer beside the door and pulled out the shotgun, loaded it, and cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. Still nothing. The steps stopped when I opened the door. I stepped out onto the back porch. The cold bit at my skin. My flashlight flickered. I scanned the woods. My eyes fell on the graveyard. A shape, standing, still, human, no movement, just standing behind the fence. I aimed the light directly at it. The beam was too weak. All I saw was a dark outline. I said nothing. I listened. The shape turned, walked into the trees behind the cemetery. Silent. I backed into the cabin and locked the door. I sat there with the shotgun across my lap until dawn. In the morning, I went back to the graveyard. There were footprints, muddy ones, human. They led from the woods to the fence, then disappeared. I packed some of my things. I thought about leaving, but something in me didn't want to back down. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe I just wanted to believe it was a hiker, a local, a drifter, something explainable. I stayed. For the next 2 nights, nothing happened. I slept with the gun near me. I kept candles burning through the night. I started thinking maybe I imagined it. Stress, alcohol withdrawal, my mind playing tricks. Then the 4th night came. I was in bed. It was past midnight. I hadn't heard anything all day. The woods had been calm. No footsteps. No steps. I started to drift off. Then a knock. Not on the front door. On the wall, right above my head. A sharp, deliberate knock. I froze. My chest tightened. I waited. Nothing. Then it came again. I jumped up, grabbed the gun, and ran outside in bare feet. I circled the cabin, shined the light. No one. Nothing. Not even tracks. The wall where I heard the knock had no porch, no steps. Just a drop-off into thick brush. No way anyone could stand there easily. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair with the shotgun across my legs, watching the windows. The next day, I found something behind the shed. A bundle of sticks, tied with twine, and inside the bundle, a strip of leather. Looked like an old belt, but on the leather were carvings. Deep, jagged cuts in the shape of symbols. Same style as what was painted inside the shed door. I burned it. That evening, I filled a few extra gas cans and put them in the car. I kept my bag packed. I left the lights on in every room. I didn't eat. I didn't read. I sat and waited. Just before 2 a.m., I saw him again. Through the front window, down the path, near the graveyard. Closer this time. He wasn't hiding. He was standing directly in the center of the path. No flashlight. No movement. Just staring. I stepped outside with the gun. Aimed at him. Didn't say a word. He didn't move. Then I heard it again. A knock. But this time from behind me. I spun around. No one. I looked back. He was gone. Gone.
No footsteps.
No sound. I ran inside and locked the door. At dawn, I walked the entire property. I found more bundles. In the woods, near the fence, under the porch. Everyone had a strip of carved leather. I drove into the nearest town that afternoon, 2 hours away. Found a hardware store, bought trail cams, new locks, and a stronger flashlight. Talked to the clerk. Asked if anyone ever mentioned strange people in the hills. He just looked at me and said, "Don't go walking after dark out there." That night, I slept in the car. Next morning, I reviewed the trail cam footage. Only one cam picked up anything. 3:12 a.m. A man, walking, slowly, through the yard, not looking at the camera, just moving from one edge of the woods to the back of the cabin. No face.
No shirt.
Just pants and boots. I copied the footage, packed everything, drove home. I never went back. I sold the land 6 months later. Cheap. The man who bought it sent me a message once, asking if I knew anything about strange symbols on the shed. I didn't reply. I don't talk about it to anyone. But sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night and hear knocking. On the wall, right above my head. I know it's in my mind. I know it has to be, but I don't sleep near windows anymore, and I keep the shotgun close. I took the job as a seasonal park ranger in the fall of 2018. I was 29 then, a few months out of a long-term relationship, and honestly just looking for a change. I had grown up in San Diego, worked various city maintenance and landscaping jobs through my 20s, and had gotten tired of the same view, same routine, same heat. I applied for a few government jobs online and got a call back from a supervisor with the Forest Service up in northern Wyoming. The job was simple enough. Monitor a remote stretch of land that included hiking trails, backcountry campsites, and an old fire lookout cabin. The cabin hadn't been used regularly in years, but they kept it stocked and ready in case of emergency, which apparently included me staying in it for several months. The nearest town was called Broad River, population around 200. The closest full grocery store was almost 90 minutes away. My supervisor, a retired ranger named Doug, met me at a service station when I arrived. He drove a beat-up Chevy Tahoe and smelled like stale coffee and pine. We didn't talk much. He handed me a keyring, a topographic map in a waterproof sleeve, a satellite radio, and a thick printed packet of emergency protocols. Then he pointed at a dirt road that climbed west into the mountains and said, "Cabin's about 12 miles up. Should still be stocked. Check in every morning by 9. I drove up into the forest in a battered Forest Service truck they'd assigned to me. The road was unpaved and narrow, winding through thick pines and yellowing aspens. I passed 2 trailheads, a fire road gate, and an old ranger sign that had half the paint peeled off. It was early October, and the air was already getting cold. I remember feeling good that day, nervous, yeah, but hopeful. I didn't know anyone for hundreds of miles, but I felt like maybe I'd find something out there in the quiet. Some peace, maybe. The cabin was exactly what I'd expected, and also not what I'd expected. It sat on a small rise overlooking a broad stretch of forest, with distant mountains visible to the west. It was a squat, sturdy-looking thing made of dark logs and rusted tin roofing. A porch ran along the front with a wooden bench, and the inside was simple bunk, wood stove, storage shelves, a small desk with a logbook, a propane stove, and a 5-gallon jug of water. There was a bear-proof storage locker outside for food, and a composting toilet maybe 100 yards away down a short trail. I unloaded my gear and settled in. The whole place smelled like wood smoke and old paper. The first week passed quietly. My job was mostly just routine checks. Hike trails to make sure there were no downed trees or signs of illegal fires, clear any debris from trail markers, keep the cabin stocked, and report any damage or suspicious activity. I'd see the occasional hiker during the day, mostly older people out enjoying the fall colors. At night, I stayed inside, read books, listened to the wind, and filled out my ranger logs. I didn't mind being alone. I'd brought enough supplies to last weeks without a resupply. Things started to change on the 10th day. It began with little things, which is probably why I didn't think much of it at first. I came back from a long hike one afternoon and noticed the latch on the food locker was hanging open. I always made sure to clip it shut. Bears were common in the area, and the smell of food could draw them from miles away. But there it was, swinging slightly in the breeze. I checked inside. Nothing was missing, but a few of the boxes had been moved around. I figured maybe I hadn't shut it tight the night before, or maybe a raccoon had fiddled with it. The next morning, I found boot prints in the dirt just behind the cabin. They weren't mine. I always wore the same pair of work boots, and these were different, narrower, with a deep, defined tread that looked newer. They came in from the east side, passed behind the cabin, and then vanished into the woods. No reason to panic, I thought. Maybe a hiker wandered off trail. Maybe someone came up the fire road and didn't check in. It wasn't illegal for people to hike back there, just uncommon. I radioed Doug that morning like I always did. I told him about the boot prints. He sounded half asleep, told me to keep an eye out but not to worry. People wander, he said. Doesn't mean anything. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the locker, the prints, the way they just disappeared. I started locking the cabin door at night even though I'd stopped bothering after the first few days. I also started carrying my knife on me when I went outside to the toilet at night, just in case. On the 12th night, I woke up around 2 a.m. and felt something was off. It was quiet, too quiet. Normally I'd hear wind through the trees, owls, the rustle of small animals, but it was dead silent. I sat up in bed and listened. Nothing, not even the creak of the cabin settling. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, just a single soft knock on the front door. Then another 5 seconds later. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just sat there staring at the door. Another knock, slower this time, like whoever was doing it was being careful. I stayed like that for over an hour, just waiting, barely moving. Eventually, I picked up the flashlight and slowly crept to the door. I didn't open it. I just looked through the small window. Nothing, just darkness and the faint shape of the trees in the moonlight. In the morning, I found more boot prints on the porch. Same tread as before. They came right up to the door and then turned and walked away. I radioed Doug again and told him what happened. He sounded annoyed. Told me maybe it was a lost hiker looking for help. Said to stay alert. Maybe leave a note on the trailhead warning people not to approach the cabin at night. That was it. I started sleeping in short bursts after that. Every sound outside put me on edge. I kept the propane stove off at night so no light leaked out through the curtains. I stopped going for long hikes and stuck close to the cabin. I started making marks in the dirt around the cabin during the day so I could see if anything was disturbed overnight. On the 15th day, I found something that changed everything. It was early morning. I just finished logging my check-in and decided to hike to a nearby overlook to clear my head. About half a mile from the cabin, just off the trail, I spotted a small circle of flattened grass. In the center was a pile of charred wood. Someone had made a fire. It was recent too, still warm to the touch. Around the fire were signs of someone camping there. A rolled-up sleeping bag, an empty bottle of water, a stained old tarp.
No tent, no pack.
No food wrappers, just the kind of thing someone might stash if they didn't want to carry too much. I checked the area carefully. About 30 yards away, behind a downed log, I found something else, a trail camera. One of the older models, camouflaged, mounted low to the ground. It was pointed toward the trail, toward the direction of the cabin. I didn't touch it, I didn't even want to be near it. I just walked back to the cabin, heart pounding, and stayed inside the rest of the day. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed my gear, loaded everything into the truck, and started down the mountain. I didn't care if it meant leaving early. Something was wrong, and nobody seemed to be taking it seriously. But 5 miles down, I found the road blocked. Someone had cut down a tree and dragged it across the dirt road. It was a fresh cut too, green sap still oozing from the trunk. Chainsaw marks on the bark. I didn't have a chainsaw, just a hatchet. It would have taken me hours to clear it. I backed the truck up to the nearest pullout, turned it around, and drove back to the cabin. The whole way, I kept checking the side mirrors, half expecting someone to be following me. That night, the knocks came again. This time, they circled the cabin. Tap on one wall, then another, then silence, then a knock behind me. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited until the sun came up. The next day, I hiked down the fire road on foot, carried a pack, brought the radio. It took me 5 hours to reach the ranger station on foot. Doug wasn't there. Some guy named Eric was filling in. I told him everything about the knocks, the prints, the fire, the trail cam. He just stared at me for a while, then said, "Yeah, that area's had problems before." I asked what kind of problems. He just said, "Transient types, people hiding out, not a lot of resources to chase them down." I quit that day. I drove back to Broad River, then straight to Casper, where I bought a bus ticket home. I left most of my gear in Wyoming. I didn't care. I just wanted out. 3 weeks later, I got a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. They didn't leave a message. 2 months after that, a news story popped up in a local paper my friends sent me. A hunter had found a small camp hidden in the woods near the cabin. Inside were a bunch of tools, empty food cans, an old radio, and a journal. Most of it was unintelligible, rambling stuff, but one of the pages had a sketch, a drawing of a cabin.
Mine.
With notes about the person staying there. Me. No arrests were made. No one claimed the camp. Authorities chalked it up to a vagrant or hermit living off-grid. I haven't been back to Wyoming since. I don't go hiking alone anymore. I lock my doors every night. And sometimes, when it's quiet and I'm alone, I swear I can still hear that soft knock. I remember the trip to the forest cabin in Oregon like it was yesterday, even though it happened 3 years ago. The memory has stuck with me, carved deep into my mind, because of how real and raw it was. Not some fantasy or ghost story, but something that could happen to anyone, anywhere. I was 27 then, recently burned out from my job as a graphic designer in Portland, needing a break from the city's noise and stress. I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the Willamette National Forest, hoping to find peace and quiet. What I got instead was something I will never forget. The cabin was owned by a small family business, a simple wooden structure nestled between tall Douglas fir trees, a little ways off the main forest road. The owner had described it as isolated but cozy, with basic amenities and a fireplace. I was sold on the idea of being alone with nature for a week. No distractions, no one around. The thought of waking up to birdsong, breathing fresh forest air, and hiking quiet trails sounded perfect. I drove the 4 hours from Portland on a clear September morning, the sunlight filtering through the green canopy of trees lining the highway. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. As I got closer to the cabin, the road turned to gravel, then dirt, narrow and winding through the dense forest. I had to park my car about half a mile from the cabin because the last stretch was too rough for the rental. I packed my gear into a backpack, sleeping bag, food supplies, a small camping stove, water, a first aid kit, and a hunting knife I'd bought for extra protection. The walk to the cabin was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of squirrels or birds. The forest floor was soft with pine needles, and patches of moss glowed a bright green in the shade. The air was cool but fresh, with a faint scent of wood smoke from a distant campfire. After 20 minutes, I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat. It was smaller than I imagined, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a porch that creaked under my steps. The wood was weathered but sturdy, with a few windows covered in dusty curtains. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of old wood, faint smoke, and something else. Musty, like damp clothes left too long. The interior was sparse. A small table, a couple of chairs, a wood stove, and a bunk bed shoved into a corner. I set down my backpack and started unpacking. I wanted to make myself comfortable before dark, so I gathered some dry wood from the porch and set it by the stove. I found the matches in an old tin box hanging on a nail by the door. The stove lit easily, and soon the cabin was warm, the flames crackling and throwing flickering shadows on the walls. As evening fell, the forest around the cabin seemed to grow darker and thicker. I sat by the window, watching the last light disappear behind the trees. The silence was complete, except for distant animal calls and the soft wind shaking the branches. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That night, I slept with the door locked and the knife under my pillow. The quiet made me uneasy in a way I hadn't expected. Every little sound, the creak of a branch, a sudden rustle in the undergrowth, made my heart jump. But I tried to tell myself it was just the forest settling for the night. The next day, I spent hiking the nearby trails, taking photos of the scenery and breathing in the fresh air. The sun was bright and the sky clear, but the forest felt vast and empty. I didn't see another person the whole day. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed a few footprints in the dirt near the porch. They were fresh, maybe a deer or some other animal. I wasn't worried yet. It was normal to see wildlife around here, but the footprints looked odd. Too big and heavy for a deer, almost human. I chalked it up to shadows and the way the ground shifted. I didn't think much of it. That night, I heard something outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or a fox scavenging near the trash. The sound was faint, soft footsteps crunching on leaves and dry twigs. But then it stopped and silence fell again. I strained my ears, trying to hear more, but nothing came. I told myself it was an animal and tried to relax. I lit a candle and sat by the stove, reading an old book I had brought along. Around midnight, I woke to a noise right outside the cabin. It sounded like someone breathing heavily, close to the door. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might wake the whole forest. I reached for the knife under my pillow, but my hands were shaking. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The breathing stopped, then I heard footsteps walking away, slow and deliberate. I waited a long time before daring to look out the window. The moon was bright, but I saw nothing. No movement in the trees, no sign of anyone. The next morning, I was on edge. I double-checked all the locks and made sure the windows were closed tight. I took a longer hiking route, further into the forest, trying to keep my mind off what had happened. But the woods felt different now, less welcoming, colder somehow. I saw a small abandoned campsite deep in the trees, with a torn tent and some old cans. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, maybe months ago. I took a few pictures but didn't linger. I wanted to get back to the cabin before dark. When I returned, I found something I didn't expect. Scratches on the cabin door, long and deep. They looked fresh, like something sharp had been dragged down the wood. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the rough grooves. There were also small bits of torn fabric caught in the splinters. My stomach turned cold. I knew then I wasn't alone. Someone had been close enough to leave those scratches while I was gone. I couldn't explain why, but fear began to gnaw at me. That night, I stayed awake most of the time, sitting by the stove with a heavy flashlight and the knife in my lap. I heard footsteps again outside, this time circling the cabin, stopping and starting. At one point, I saw a shadow move past the window, tall and thin. I didn't sleep. I barely blinked. When the first light crept over the horizon, I packed a small bag, ready to leave. But just as I was about to step outside, I heard a voice, low, rough, angry, just a few feet from the door. I couldn't understand the words, but it was clear the person was close, watching. I forced myself not to panic. I waited, holding the door handle tight, ready to bolt. Suddenly, the door shook violently. Someone was trying to break in. I pushed back hard, but the cabin door wasn't made for this kind of force. The wood creaked and splintered under the blows. I grabbed the stove poker, holding it like a weapon. The door cracked open a little. I saw a pair of wild eyes staring in the dark. I acted fast. I pushed the door shut, slammed it with all my strength, and locked it again. Then I ran to the back window, opened it, and climbed out into the cold morning air. I ran through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, the sounds of someone chasing me behind. I didn't look back. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get far away. I kept running until I reached the dirt road where I'd left my car. My legs were bleeding, my breath ragged, but I jumped in and started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was back in Portland, the city noise drowning out the forest silence. I never went back to that cabin or that forest. I reported what happened to the local sheriff, but they found no trace of the man who tried to break in. They said it could have been a drifter or someone hiding out in the woods. But I know what I saw, what I felt. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear footsteps outside my window, soft and slow. And I remember that cabin in Oregon, the feeling of being hunted, the raw fear of a killer in the forest. It was late September 2021 when I decided to return to the cabin. I hadn't been there in almost 6 years, not since the divorce. 2 months ago, my ex-husband Mark died in a car accident just outside of Bend. We hadn't spoken in years. His sister called to tell me, which I found odd, but she said I was still listed as the next of kin in the old emergency contact forms. I didn't even know they still had those. After we split, he kept the cabin. I never really fought him for it. Too many memories, some good, but most not. Mark liked being away from people. He wanted that life more than he wanted a marriage. I left it behind like everything else tied to him. I wasn't going to go back. Not until I found out from his sister that there wasn't much of a will, and that technically I could still access the place. That part of Oregon had been hit with wildfires the year before, and she didn't want to go up there herself. I told her I didn't want anything from it, but she mentioned there were some of my old things still there. Photos, boxes of books, some letters from my dad who passed when I was young. Things I had forgotten even existed. So I packed up a few days' worth of clothes, filled the tank of my Subaru, and headed east from Portland, just as the sky was starting to cloud over. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I don't really keep many friends these days. Just a few people I talk to now and then. I guess I thought it would be a simple trip in and out. A few nights at most. Get what I wanted and leave the rest. No big deal. The cabin was on a small stretch of land about 15 miles past a little town called Fox Creek. It wasn't even a real town anymore. Just a diner, a gas station, and a post office that might have been closed. From the highway, the road narrowed to a gravel path that led up into the forest. The trees were still thick up there, but the smell of ash hung faintly in the air even now. The wildfires had licked the edges of Mark's property but hadn't made it all the way. He got lucky, for once. I arrived just before dusk on the first night. The cabin looked mostly the same. weathered cedar planks, moss growing in spots along the base, and the front steps slightly warped from years of moisture and snow. I hadn't brought much, just a backpack, a flashlight, a heavy coat, and a box of food and bottled water. I didn't trust the well pump. The plumbing was always questionable up here. When I unlocked the door, the air inside was stale. Dust hung in the light that slipped through the crooked blinds. It smelled like old wood, mold, and something else I couldn't place. Something metallic. I opened the windows and let the air flow through while I walked the place. Mark had clearly been living there more than just on weekends. There were cans of beans and soup stacked in the pantry, clothes in the dresser, and some of his old books and notebooks spread across the small table by the fireplace. I didn't sleep well that first night. The wind kicked up hard around midnight, and the old cabin groaned like it was shifting in its skin. I laid in the loft on the thin mattress we used to share and stared up at the wood beams above me, listening to the creaks and hisses the place made as if it were alive. I used to be comforted by those noises. Now they just made me tense. The next morning, I started looking for my things. I found 2 of the boxes in the crawl space behind the bedroom. Old photos of my dad and me fishing when I was little, letters he wrote from when he was stationed in Germany in the 80s, and some books I'd forgotten I even owned. I sat on the floor going through them while drinking lukewarm instant coffee, the silence pressing in around me from all sides. Out here, you could hear your own heartbeat. Around noon, I stepped outside to stretch my legs and walked down the short trail that led to the creek. It was low, barely a trickle now, but the ground near it was soft and dark. I noticed what looked like tire tracks curving off the trail and disappearing behind the thicker brush. I didn't think much of it. Maybe Mark had a friend come visit. Maybe someone from the fire crew came by during the wildfires. Or maybe just an old set of his own. It didn't feel weird yet. I spent most of that day organizing what I wanted to take and what I would leave behind. Some of the things he had lying around I didn't want to touch. His boots still by the door, the stained mug on the table, his coat hanging from the wall hook. I decided I'd leave by morning. I didn't need more than that. The cabin gave me a bad feeling the longer I stayed. That night was colder. I lit a fire in the wood stove, but the heat didn't reach upstairs. I wore socks and gloves and wrapped myself in 2 layers of blankets. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was light and broken. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound. Not the creaking of wood or whine through the trees. This was something else. It was metallic, like a soft click or snap, close but outside. I lay still, holding my breath, heart racing. Then it came again, click, from around the side of the cabin. The fire had died down. I couldn't see much from the loft, but the moonlight coming through the windows gave the place a faint silver hue. I stayed frozen for what felt like 20 minutes, waiting for something else. Another sound, a movement. Nothing came. I told myself it could have been a branch snapping or something falling from the roof. Maybe a small animal. I eventually drifted back to sleep, uneasy but too tired to stay up. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. I saw a partial boot print in the soft dirt just beyond the deck. It wasn't mine. I hadn't walked over there. It was bigger than mine, too, and fresher than the others I'd seen the day before. I looked around for more, but the leaves and pine needles had covered most of the area. Still, that one print was enough to tighten something in my chest. That day, I packed everything. I stuffed the boxes in the car, locked up the cabin, and told myself I'd drive back to Portland before dark. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the car made a click, click, click sound and then nothing. I tried again. Nothing. The lights worked. The battery wasn't dead. I popped the hood and stared at the engine, but I had no idea what I was looking for. I'd had it serviced a few weeks ago. I had no cell service. I walked down the gravel road for about half a mile hoping to catch a signal, but the bar never moved. The nearest real town was almost 20 miles away. I wasn't about to start hiking it. I decided I'd try again in the morning, maybe give the car a break and hope for the best. Maybe it would magically fix itself overnight. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint noises, something like breathing but not my own, like weight shifting on the deck, like someone testing the wood. The fire was dead. The moon was covered by clouds. I laid in total darkness, listening, and then came the sound of the door handle, a slow, soft jostle, just one, not hard, not like someone trying to break in, just testing. I held my breath, my whole body locked up. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my flashlight. I didn't even want to breathe loud enough to give myself away. I waited. The handle didn't move again, but I didn't sleep at all after that. At first light, I walked out and checked the door. Nothing broken, nothing left behind. But my boots, which I had left on the porch, were moved. They weren't where I put them. They were turned sideways, one half off the edge of the step. I was sure of it. No animal did that. I tried the car again. Still nothing. That day, I made a plan. I'd hike down to Fox Creek. It would take hours, but I could get help there. I loaded a small backpack with water, food, and a flashlight and started down the road by noon. I walked for over 2 hours without seeing a single vehicle. No one came. The road curved and dipped through thick trees. Then I saw it. A truck, off the road about 30 yards into the woods, parked awkwardly under the trees. Old, rusted, with a blue tarp hanging from the bed like someone had slept in it. The door was cracked open. No one inside. I stopped walking. My stomach dropped. I turned around and walked back to the cabin. I know, I should have kept going, but something about that truck scared me more than the idea of staying. It felt wrong, like someone had been watching the road, like I was being herded back. That night, I didn't go to sleep. I sat in the corner of the loft with a hammer I found in Mark's old toolbox. I kept the flashlight on but pointed down so it wouldn't give me away. I stayed there all night, heart pounding with every creak, every sound. And around 3 a.m., I saw someone, just outside the window, a figure, motionless, watching, not close, not right up to the glass, just far enough back to be almost missed. I blinked and they were gone. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just waited for the sun to rise. The next morning, the car started. Just like that. I didn't question it. I didn't look back. I drove fast and didn't stop until I hit the main road. I passed the diner in Fox Creek and didn't even consider stopping. My hands didn't stop shaking until I saw the sign for Bend an hour later. I never told anyone about what happened. I didn't file a report. I didn't go back. I had nightmares for weeks. Nightmares of someone just standing still in the trees, not doing anything, not chasing, just waiting. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Mark's sister again. She told me someone had broken into the cabin, smashed the windows, stole some tools. She thought maybe it was just a drifter or a hunter. She wanted to know if I wanted to deal with it or just sign the place over to her. I told her to take it. I never wanted to see that place again, and I never have. It was the fall of 2017 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend a week alone in a small cabin up in northern Vermont. I was 29 at the time, working in a dull office job that sucked the life out of me. My dog, a medium-sized black lab named Jasper, came along. He was about 4 years old then, and the closest thing I had to a real friend. I figured some time in the woods with Jasper would clear my head. I rented the cabin through a local owner. It was an old wooden structure, built sometime in the 1930s, with peeling green paint and a sagging porch. It stood on the edge of a dense pine forest, with a narrow dirt road leading to it that wound through miles of trees. The closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and there was no cell service at the cabin. That was part of the reason I wanted to go there. No distractions, no noise, just me and the dog. The first day was crisp and cool, with a pale sun cutting through the early morning fog. The forest around the cabin was thick with tall pines and birches, their leaves a riot of orange and gold. Jasper sniffed around excitedly, darting between the trees and chasing invisible things in the underbrush. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A wood stove stood in the corner of the main room, surrounded by a few wooden chairs and a small table. The kitchen was tiny, with a rusty old sink and a gas stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. There was a small bedroom with a narrow bed and a faded quilt, and a bathroom with a cracked porcelain sink. I spent the afternoon unpacking and getting firewood. Jasper followed me everywhere, his tail wagging, his nose to the ground. I felt calm, almost peaceful. The silence was thick but not empty. It had a weight to it, the sound of wind through the trees, the occasional creak of a branch. At night, the woods seemed to hold their breath. The second day, I explored a bit farther from the cabin. Jasper and I followed a faint trail that disappeared into the pines, climbing a gentle hill that gave a good view over the valley below. From up there, the patchwork of forest and farmland stretched for miles, dotted with barns and quiet houses. The sky was clear blue, the sun warm on my face. But as the day wore on, something about the woods started to feel different. The birdsong stopped, and even Jasper grew quiet, his ears pricked and his body tense. I noticed the shadows stretching longer and darker, even though it was only late afternoon. A cold wind swept through the trees, making the pine needles shiver. We hurried back to the cabin, and I locked the door behind me. Jasper lay at my feet, eyes flicking toward the windows. Outside, the forest was alive with movement. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but no animals I could see. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or small critters, but the feeling in my gut was hard to shake. That night, I built a fire in the stove and sat close to it. Jasper curled beside me. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Every now and then, I heard a sharp crack outside, like a heavy branch falling. I kept telling myself I was safe, but sleep wouldn't come easy. On the third day, things got worse. Early in the morning, Jasper started barking fiercely at the back door. I got up quickly, pulling on my jacket, and opened the door. The woods were dark and still, but on the porch lay something that made my blood run cold. A bundle of sticks and pine cones arranged in a circle, with some dried leaves and dirt scattered in the middle like a crude pattern. I stared at it, heart pounding. Whoever had left it was close by. I felt a sudden wave of fear that was different from before. Something calculated, like someone was watching me. I called Jasper inside and bolted the door. The rest of the day, I stayed close to the cabin, pacing and checking the windows. I kept hearing noises out in the trees, footsteps crunching on dead leaves, twigs snapping. But whenever I looked out, I saw nothing. The nights were the worst. Every sound felt like a threat, every shadow a person waiting just outside the door. Jasper refused to sleep, growling low whenever I moved. I kept the fire burning all night and stayed awake, watching. By the fourth day, I was exhausted and paranoid. I couldn't shake the feeling someone was lurking near the cabin, waiting for me to let my guard down. I found more signs outside, footprints in the dirt that weren't mine or Jasper's, broken branches on the trail, strange marks carved into the bark of a tree a few yards from the cabin. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted. The nearest town was at least an hour away, and without cell service, I couldn't call for help. I was trapped out here with Jasper and a growing fear that something bad was coming. That evening, I tried to ignore it and cook some food over the stove. Jasper was restless, pacing and growling at the door again. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the cabin, like someone pounding on the walls. I froze, heart hammering. The banging came again, slow and heavy, then stopped. I didn't move. Jasper growled low in his throat. Minutes passed like hours. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound outside, like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the table and crept to the window. Outside, the trees were black shadows, but I could make out a figure moving between the trunks. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could tell it was a man. Tall, wearing a dark jacket, and walking slowly around the cabin. I slammed the window shut and locked it, heart pounding so loud I thought Jasper would hear it too. I didn't know what to do. I was alone, scared, and trapped. The banging started again, louder and more urgent. Then the door handle rattled. I stood frozen, flashlight in hand, listening. After what felt like forever, the noises stopped. The figure disappeared into the trees. I waited until dawn, too scared to move. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed up quickly, loaded Jasper into the truck, and took the dirt road back toward the main highway. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. I never went back to that cabin. My name is Luke Renshaw. I'm 36 now, but this happened when I was 28. I was living in northern Idaho at the time, out near Priest River. It was late September 2017, a week after I quit my construction job in Spokane. I was burnt out, tired of people, noise, expectations. I wanted to be left alone for a while. I had this idea of building a small off-grid cabin on a piece of wooded land I bought from an older guy I met at a flea market the year before. The plot was just over 4 acres, all thick pines and damp soil, no utilities, about a 30-minute drive down a gravel road off the highway. No one else lived on that stretch, not even seasonal hunters. It was just remote enough to make you feel completely detached. I'd spent the summer slowly bringing in supplies, tarps, nails, hand tools, a propane stove, a water jug, canned food, a tarp tent for temporary shelter, and a portable solar panel that barely powered my phone or a flashlight. I kept most of the supplies in a plastic storage container I buried under a camouflage tarp near a large fir tree, in case someone stumbled across the place and got curious. I didn't want anything fancy, just a place to sleep, keep dry, maybe spend the winter if I could get the stove working. It was more about the process. I needed to do something with my hands. I needed to prove I could live with less. By the time that night came, I had the basic frame of the cabin up. For walls made of salvaged 2x4s, each about 8 feet tall, bolted to a plywood floor I'd leveled over gravel and stone. No windows yet, no insulation, and the roof was just thick plastic sheeting held down with rocks and bungee cords. It was drafty, but better than the tarp tent I had been sleeping in. It had rained all day hard, cold, early fall rain that soaked the forest and never let up. The kind that starts before you wake up and doesn't stop until long after dark. Everything was wet. My boots had taken on water hours before, and my hands were raw from hammering nails with wet gloves. I'd started building a little loft inside the cabin, just something elevated off the ground to keep my sleeping bag from the cold floor, but I didn't get far. By dusk, the clouds were heavy and low, almost greenish in the distance. Thunder kept rumbling. I could hear limbs cracking somewhere out in the trees, maybe from the weight of water. Around 6, I decided to stop working, eat something, and try to get some rest. I sat on a 5-gallon bucket inside the unfinished cabin, with the rain smacking down on the plastic roof, and opened a can of chili with my pocket knife. It was cold. I didn't care. My propane stove had stopped working the day before. Some leak I couldn't find. I hadn't had a warm meal in over 24 hours. The wind picked up. It didn't howl like in movies. It just pressed itself against the trees, made them sway and groan. The plastic over the roof kept flapping up at the edges. I set 2 heavy rocks at each corner to keep it from peeling back. I could already tell the corners were leaking. The floor was slick in places. I dried it with a flannel shirt, but it was useless. By nightfall, I lay on the loft I built from old pallets, wrapped in a damp sleeping bag, jacket still on. It was cold, not freezing, but cold enough that you could feel it in your bones. My little LED lantern gave off a soft yellow light, barely strong enough to see the beams above me. Then I heard something. At first I thought it was just more branches falling, maybe an animal moving through the brush. But the sound was too steady. It came from the north side of the cabin, the side that faced a slope leading down to a shallow creek. A dull thud, then another, like something was stepping in the mud, moving slowly. I told myself it was a deer, maybe an elk. They're curious sometimes. Maybe it had wandered close looking for food. I sat up and turned off the lantern. My heart was beating a little faster now, but I didn't panic. I waited. I listened. The rain muffled everything, but I could still hear it. A slow, careful crunching sound, maybe 20 yards out. Then silence. A full minute passed. Then the same sound again. Closer this time. Crunch. Stop. Crunch. Stop. I held my breath. There was no reason for someone to be out here. No trails, no cabins, no hunting until October. And even if it was someone lost, they would have called out, made noise. This was deliberate, quiet. I reached for my hatchet. I always kept it beside me when I slept. Not because I was afraid, but because it made me feel like I had some control out here. I gripped it in my right hand and stayed low. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't hear them anymore. Then came the sound of something brushing against the plastic wall of the cabin. A hand? A branch? Couldn't tell. But it wasn't the wind. It moved too slowly. Deliberate again. A single stroke, like someone dragging fingers across the sheeting. Then silence. I stayed frozen for what felt like 10 minutes. The rain kept coming, harder now, and I kept listening for movement, for anything. But whoever or whatever it was didn't make another sound. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the loft with the hatchet in my hand, eyes locked on the dark outline of the doorway I hadn't even built a proper door for yet. Just a hanging tarp, half soaked, flapping in the wind. Every now and then I thought I heard something, but it was probably just branches falling or the tarp stretching. My body was stiff and sore, but I didn't move. By morning, the rain had slowed to a mist. Everything outside looked like it was coated in silver fog. I stepped out, every muscle tense. There were prints in the mud. Not boots, not hooves, bare feet. I stared at them for a long time. They weren't small, maybe size 10 or 11, wide, deep in the mud, like someone had stood still watching the cabin for a while. I followed them for about 30 feet before they disappeared into the brush and vanished downhill toward the creek. No one should have been out here barefoot in that kind of weather. No one's sane anyway. I went back to the cabin and packed my bag. I didn't want to be there another night, but I didn't leave either. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the door frame. I cut new boards, made a proper latch out of scrap metal and wire. I hung a heavy tarp over the inside wall and stacked whatever I had along the corners. Buckets, leftover wood, anything I could use as a barrier. I wanted to finish what I started. Leaving would feel like giving up, or running. But that night, the footsteps came back. Later this time, closer to midnight. This time, no movement. Just the sound of someone standing outside. Breathing, maybe. Couldn't hear it, but I could feel it. There's this instinct that tells you when you're being watched, and I swear, something was out there just staring into the cabin.
No knocking.
No talking, just standing. And again, barefoot. I could tell by the squelch in the mud. I didn't light the lantern. I just laid there, staring through the dark, gripping the hatchet like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to my body. I waited, shaking, cold sweat down my neck, stomach in knots. I didn't move. Hours passed. The sound never came closer. By morning, it was gone again, just like before. Prints in the mud, standing near the door, then vanishing down toward the creek. I followed again, but they disappeared just as fast. This went on for 4 nights. Never once did I see a face. Never once did they try to come in. They just stood there, watching. On the 5th day, I hiked 3 miles out to the highway, hitched a ride into town with an older couple in a rusted pickup. I didn't explain much, just said I needed a break from the woods. I spent the next few nights in a cheap motel. Hot shower, dry sheets, noise from the street. I never felt safer, but something about leaving that cabin felt wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was out there? Why didn't they try anything? Why just watch? 3 weeks later, I went back. I brought a friend with me, someone I used to work with who had done tours in Afghanistan. We camped at the site for 3 nights. Nothing happened.
No sounds. No prints.
No visitors. He thought I imagined it. I didn't argue. I let him think what he wanted. Eventually, I finished the cabin, added real insulation, sealed the roof, put in a wood stove that worked better than I expected. I even stayed the winter, never saw or heard anything again. But I never forgot those nights. The rain, the quiet, the feeling of someone just outside the wall, never speaking, never leaving a name. Some people don't believe me. Others say it was a drifter or someone with mental problems. Could be. Maybe someone just trying to survive. Maybe someone who lived in those woods long before I bought the land. All I know is they were real. They didn't want to hurt me, but they wanted me to know I wasn't alone. And after those nights, I never really felt alone again. It was the autumn of 1997, a cold, quiet fall in northern Vermont. I was 24 years old at the time, tired of the noise and pressure of city life in Boston. I wanted to get away for a few days, just to clear my head and breathe some fresh air. I'd found a small cabin online, rented it for a long weekend. The place was deep in the woods near a tiny town called Edenbridge, a place so small you wouldn't find it on most maps. It was about a 4-hour drive from Boston, and the last hour was on a rough dirt road that twisted through dense forest. I remember feeling a strange mix of excitement and nervousness as I turned off the paved highway onto that bumpy trail. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, built mostly of rough-hewn logs and stone. It sat alone in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, the kind that block out the sky and make the world feel smaller and quieter. The first thing I noticed when I pulled up was how still everything was. No birds sang, no wind moved the trees, just silence thick and heavy. It made my skin crawl a little, but I told myself it was normal for the deep woods. I stepped inside, dropping my bags on the wooden floor. The cabin smelled like damp wood and old smoke. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a kitchen with some rusty pots and pans, a bed with a thin mattress, and a table made from rough planks. The first day passed slowly. I unpacked, explored the little clearing outside, and collected some firewood. I noticed how the sun dipped quickly behind the trees, leaving the forest in shadow by late afternoon. I made a fire in the stove and cooked some canned soup. The warmth from the fire felt good, but it also made the cabin feel smaller, almost like a trap. I kept checking the windows, watching the dark trees just beyond the glass. At night, the forest around me was alive with strange sounds. I heard the rustle of leaves, the crack of twigs, and sometimes a distant animal howl that echoed through the cold air. I lay awake for hours, staring at the rough ceiling, listening to every little noise. The silence was overwhelming, almost unnatural. Felt like the woods were watching me, waiting for something. I told myself to calm down and that this was just the wilderness, but a small part of me didn't believe it. The next morning, I woke early and decided to hike the trail I'd seen on the map. It wasn't marked well, just a faint path disappearing into the trees. The forest was dense, the ground covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. The air was cold and sharp, and the smell of wet earth filled my nose. I walked for over an hour, sometimes hearing a bird or squirrel, but mostly just the crunch of my boots on the ground. I found an old, broken-down hunting cabin deep in the woods. It looked abandoned for years. The door hung off its hinges, the windows were shattered, and the roof sagged. Inside, the floor was covered with dirt and leaves. I didn't stay long, just a quick look before heading back. When I returned, I noticed something strange. There were footprints around the clearing near my cabin. They looked fresh, like someone had walked there recently. I froze and stared. The prints were too big for me, maybe a man's size. I checked the rest of the area. No other signs, no trash or anything left behind. Just footprints. I didn't see anyone or hear a sound, but I felt like someone had been watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was probably a hunter or a local passing by, but I was careful after that, keeping the door locked and the windows shut. I stayed inside the rest of the day, reading and keeping the fire going. The shadows grew longer, and the cold seeped in through the cracks in the walls. That night was worse than the first. I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would give me away. I grabbed the old hunting rifle I'd brought for protection and sat by the window, watching. The beam of my flashlight swept the trees, but I saw nothing but darkness and the twisted shapes of branches. The footsteps stopped suddenly. Then I heard a soft thud against the cabin wall, like something heavy hitting wood. I looked closer, but nothing showed in the dark. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, waiting for more sounds. When nothing else came, I finally let out a shaky breath and tried to sleep. The next morning, I found more signs. Scratches on the wood near the door, deep claw marks that hadn't been there before. The firewood pile was scattered, and some logs were broken. Whoever or whatever had been there last night was close and growing bolder. I packed some extra supplies into my bag, ready to leave if things got worse. I decided to check the perimeter around the cabin. Walking the edges of the clearing, I saw more footprints, some leading deeper into the forest. The ground was soft and wet from recent rain, making the tracks clear and easy to follow. They weren't animal prints either, too big and too human-shaped. I followed the trail for a few hundred feet before it disappeared into the thick trees. A sinking feeling filled me. I was no longer alone out here, and whoever was nearby wasn't just passing through. I thought about calling for help, but there was no cell signal. The cabin was too remote, cut off from any real contact. That night, I barely slept. The sounds were constant. Footsteps circling the cabin, branches snapping close by, heavy breathing I couldn't place. I held the rifle close, ready to defend myself. At one point, I heard the door handle jiggle. Someone had tried to get in. The fear was suffocating, but I stayed quiet and still. After what seemed like hours, the noises stopped. I waited until dawn before I moved. The morning light was a relief, but the danger hadn't passed. I packed everything quickly and left the cabin behind. I stuck to the dirt road and kept walking until I found a small ranger station where I finally got a signal. I called the local sheriff and reported what had happened. They said they would send someone to check the cabin, but warned me that this part of the woods was known for illegal hunters and trespassers who sometimes caused trouble. Weeks later, I learned that the sheriff's deputies had found signs of people living near the cabin, makeshift camps, stolen supplies, and evidence that someone had been watching the area for months. They never caught anyone, but the area was marked off, and the cabin was boarded up. I never went back to Edenbridge. The experience stayed with me for a long time, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, just real people with real danger, hiding in the quiet woods, waiting for their chance. It was late September when I decided to go up to the cabin. I had just turned 28 and felt the need to get away from the noise of the city, from the constant buzz of work and people. I needed silence, something simple and real. The cabin was my grandfather's, an old wooden place buried deep in the pines near a small lake in northern Vermont. It wasn't much. A single room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a loft where I slept. But it was mine, and it had always felt like a refuge. I packed light, a few changes of clothes, canned food, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, a hunting knife, and enough firewood to last a few days. I also brought my old camera, not because I expected anything special, but to keep my mind occupied. The road leading to the cabin was rough, mostly dirt and gravel, barely maintained by the town. I drove an old pickup, the kind that didn't mind a bumpy ride. I arrived just before sunset. The sun hung low in the sky, orange and red, filtering through the dense pine trees. The air smelled sharp, fresh, and cool, a sudden reminder that autumn was in full swing. I parked near the cabin and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The silence was almost overwhelming. No cars, no people, just the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds settling in for the night. The cabin looked the same as always, the weathered wood dark from years of rain, the windows clouded with dust and spider webs. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, feeling the familiar scent of pine wood and old smoke from the fireplace. I stacked my firewood near the hearth and started a small fire, watching the flames flicker and catch the dry logs. The first night was peaceful. I settled into the loft with a blanket and my camera on the small wooden table below. The sounds outside were gentle, the wind through the trees, the distant splash of fish jumping in the lake, an owl hooting far off. I felt safe here, tucked away from the world. The second day, I decided to explore a little. I walked around the lake, the water clear and cold, reflecting the sky and the tall trees around it. I noticed the trail I had never taken before, a narrow path weaving deeper into the forest. Curiosity pushed me forward. The trail was rough, tangled with roots and fallen branches, but it was quiet and beautiful. The sunlight barely touched the ground through the thick canopy of leaves. Birds darted through the branches, and every now and then, I spotted a squirrel or a chipmunk. The air was cooler here, damp with the smell of moss and decaying leaves. As I walked further, I came across something odd. A series of deep footprints in the soft earth. They looked fresh, pressed deep as if something heavy had walked here recently. They were too large to be a deer or any animal I knew. I followed the prints for a while, but then they disappeared near a cluster of fallen trees. My heart picked up a little. It wasn't the fear of the unknown, but the simple awareness that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Someone or something had been here recently. The idea made me both nervous and alert. I didn't want to turn back just yet, but I kept the knife in my pocket ready. That night, I heard noises. I lay in the loft, the fire dying low, the wind howling outside like a cold breath over the trees. There was a snapping sound, like a branch breaking, coming from the edge of the forest. Then soft rustling, footsteps maybe, moving just beyond the clearing where the cabin stood. I sat up slowly, heart pounding, eyes adjusting to the dark. My flashlight was on the table just out of reach. I stayed still, listening. The sounds moved around the cabin slowly, circling, stopping, then moving again. It didn't feel like an animal. Animals make quick, sharp noises. This was deliberate, slow, almost cautious. I grabbed the flashlight and the knife, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. The air was cold, sharp against my skin. The trees loomed like tall, silent guards. The moon was a thin crescent, barely lighting the forest floor. I scanned the tree line with the flashlight. Shadows danced and shifted. I called out, but no voice answered. My own voice sounded strange in the emptiness. I kept moving around the cabin, shining the beam into the dark, but there was nothing there. No eyes reflecting back, no movement. When I got back inside, I locked the door carefully and piled some heavy furniture against it. I slept lightly, the fire burning low, my knife close. The next morning, I found something even stranger. On the front porch, just where the firewood had been stacked, were fresh footprints, the same size and shape as the ones I had seen on the trail. They led away from the cabin toward the lake, then stopped at the water's edge. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. It was clear whoever had been here had come close, maybe had even watched me while I slept. But why? What did they want? I checked my camera and found something unsettling. On a photo I had taken by accident when setting the timer, there was a faint shape in the background near the tree line. It looked like a man, tall and thin, standing still and watching. The image was blurry, almost like a shadow, but there was no mistake. Someone had been there, and they had stayed long enough to be captured. I didn't say anything to anyone. I didn't want to tell my friends or family. It felt private, something I had to deal with alone. Over the next 2 days, I kept the fire going all night, and I didn't go far from the cabin during the day. I stayed alert, always checking the woods around me, always listening. The footprints appeared again, around the back of the cabin, near the trees, sometimes just outside the window. Each time they appeared, they seemed fresher, as if whoever was doing this was moving closer. I thought about leaving, but something held me back. Maybe it was stubbornness or the feeling that I couldn't just run. The cabin was mine, and I wasn't going to let some unknown presence push me out. On the fourth night, the sounds were worse. The wind had picked up, shaking the trees with violent gusts. The forest was alive with noise, leaves scraping, branches snapping, the distant howl of a coyote. Then, closer, there were footsteps again, slow and heavy, moving all around the cabin. I sat in the dark near the fireplace, holding the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I could hear the breath of the forest, the soft thuds of steps circling me, almost like a predator stalking its prey. But no eyes showed in the darkness. No shapes moved under the moonlight. Then something touched the cabin, light but deliberate. A finger brushing the window, a soft tap on the door. I froze. My mind raced with every possibility, every danger. Who was this? What did they want? Were they dangerous? I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my jacket, my knife, and my pack. I planned to leave at first light, no matter what. Morning came cold and gray. I lit a small fire, packed my things, and double-checked the cabin. The footprints were everywhere now, around the porch, circling the cabin like a warning. I felt eyes on me, even though I saw no one. I left the cabin door unlocked. Part of me hoped whoever had been there would follow me, but I didn't want to risk a confrontation. The drive back was tense. Every shadow by the roadside looked like a figure watching. Every sudden noise made me jump. I kept the windows up, the locks on, and the radio playing quietly. Back in town, I tried to forget the cabin and the strange presence I had felt. I told myself it was probably a hunter or someone else living rough in the woods, but something about it didn't sit right. No hunter would circle a cabin for days without approaching or announcing themselves. No hunter would leave footprints like a game, marking territory. I decided to check the local ranger station about the area around the cabin. The ranger told me no one had reported missing persons or anything unusual near the lake recently. The forests here were mostly empty except for hikers or fishermen, and none had noticed anyone suspicious. It didn't explain the footprints or the feeling of being watched. Weeks passed, and I slowly stopped thinking about the cabin. Work and life demanded my attention. But one day, a package arrived, no return address, just my name. Inside was a single photograph, worn and creased, showing the cabin. In the corner, barely visible, was the same tall figure I had caught in my camera, standing just at the edge of the trees. No note, no explanation. That was the last straw. I never went back to the cabin again. Months later, I heard from a friend who lived nearby. They told me the cabin had been broken into and vandalized. Nothing was stolen, just strange symbols painted on the walls, chairs overturned, the firewood burned to ashes. I couldn't understand why anyone would do that. Who would come here just to leave signs and disappear? I realized then it wasn't a ghost, not some fairy tale creature. It was a person, a real, living person who wanted me to know they had been there. Someone who had chosen to haunt a place not with spirits but with silence, shadows, and fear. That experience stayed with me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters, but people. People who live in the woods, watching from the darkness, leaving traces without ever showing their face. Years later, I still think about the cabin, the footprints, and that quiet presence lurking just beyond the trees. I have learned to listen to silence in a different way now, to respect it, but also to fear it, because sometimes silence is not empty. Sometimes silence is waiting. I remember the trip like it was yesterday, though it happened 2 summers ago. The year was 2023. I was 29 then, working as a project coordinator for a medium-sized software company in Northern Oregon. My boss, Mark, was in his late 40s, calm, serious, the kind of guy who kept his work and personal life separate. His grandma's old cabin was where we ended up that weekend, out in the dense woods near a small town called Elk Ridge, about a 2-hour drive from Portland. Mark had mentioned the cabin in passing months earlier. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would just casually rent. It belonged to his grandmother, who had passed away a few years before, and the property had been unused since. But Mark needed a break, and surprisingly, he invited me along. I wasn't about to refuse. We arrived late Friday afternoon. The sun was already dipping low behind the towering pines, and the temperature was dropping fast. The gravel road leading to the cabin was narrow and uneven, lined with thick underbrush. I drove carefully, watching for sudden dips or roots pushing up through the dirt. The cabin was a modest, weathered wooden structure, standing about 50 yards back from the road, surrounded by a chaotic patch of wildflowers, tall grass, and tangled blackberry bushes. It looked untouched for a long time. The wood was darkened by decades of rain and sun. The windows were clouded and grimy, and the chimney had clearly not been used in months. Mark handed me a heavy duffel bag and a small cardboard box with some food and supplies. He had already unloaded a few things from his truck, a couple of folding chairs, a small propane stove, and a cooler. "This place hasn't been lived in for years," Mark said quietly as he unlocked the door. The lock creaked and groaned, rusty and stiff, but eventually gave way. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dry pine needles, and something faintly sour. Maybe mold or stale air trapped for too long. The interior was sparse. A rickety table sat in the center of the main room, surrounded by 4 mismatched chairs. A cast iron stove stood in one corner, and an old, faded rug covered part of the creaky wooden floor. Mark started unpacking and cleaning, wiping dust off shelves, and clearing cobwebs from corners. I helped by stacking firewood he found piled near the back porch. The sky outside faded quickly, turning from orange to deep blue, then black. The first stars began to twinkle overhead. We cooked a simple dinner of canned beans heated on the stove and ate sitting close to the fire Mark managed to get going. The flames crackled loudly in the quiet night. Beyond the cabin walls, the woods were dense and thick with shadows. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and distant calls of owls. That night, I slept on a narrow cot in the smaller room off the main area. The mattress was thin and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was better than nothing. The wind whispered through cracks in the walls, and every now and then, the cabin creaked as if settling deeper into the earth. I woke suddenly around 2 a.m. There was a faint tapping noise outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was rhythmic and deliberate, like something or someone was knocking gently on the wooden porch. I froze, heart pounding. The cabin was supposed to be miles from the nearest neighbor, and no one knew we were here. Mark was in the main room, asleep. I debated waking him, but decided to stay quiet. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped. I told myself it was a branch or an animal, but sleep didn't come easily after that. Morning came slow, with muted sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. Over breakfast, Mark mentioned hearing strange noises too, but brushed it off as forest animals or wind. The rest of the day was spent exploring the property. There was an old shed at the edge of the clearing, partially collapsed, filled with rusted tools and broken furniture. The land sloped down to a small creek surrounded by ferns and mossy stones. I found tracks near the water, deer prints for sure, but something else too, larger, heavier, with irregular claws. Mark and I joked nervously about bears, but we both knew no bears had been reported near the cabin in years. That evening, as the sun was setting, we sat outside the cabin, sipping lukewarm coffee. The woods seemed quiet at first, but then came the sounds, soft footsteps crunching dry leaves, distant twigs snapping. We looked around but saw nothing. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees, a shadow darting quickly behind a large pine. It wasn't an animal. It moved with a strange, jerky gait. Mark saw it too. His face tightened, but he said nothing. We spent the night in the cabin, doors locked, windows shuttered with old boards Mark found in the shed. Sleep was impossible. At some point, the tapping started again, this time louder, more insistent, like someone was trying to get inside. I stayed awake all night, listening to every creak, every snap, every breath of wind. By dawn, Mark and I decided to leave immediately. We packed quickly, throwing everything into the truck. As we drove away down the twisting gravel road, I glanced back once. In the tree line, just beyond the clearing, a figure stood watching us. Tall, thin, wrapped in dark clothes, face hidden. Mark didn't speak until we were miles away. "I never told anyone about this place," he said quietly. "Grandma always said the woods were unsettled, said some people shouldn't be near it." I didn't ask what he meant. Back in Portland, life went on, but the memory stayed. That feeling of being watched, the unseen presence lurking just beyond the firelight. A few weeks after the trip, I asked Mark about the cabin again. He told me he sold the property quietly to someone who promised to keep it private. He never wanted to go back. Looking back, I realized it wasn't some ghost or fantasy. It was something real. People who didn't want us there, who were hiding in the woods for reasons we couldn't understand. Maybe squatters, criminals, or just locals with a grudge. The silence, the tapping, the shadow, they were warnings, a message to leave. I learned that sometimes the scariest things are not stories or legends, but the raw, uncomfortable reality of isolation and the unknown. Since then, I avoid isolated places. The city noise, the crowds, the constant light, they are my comfort now. Because out there, in the dark woods by that old cabin, I saw something that changed me forever. Something human but not friendly. Something that reminded me how small and vulnerable we really are. I was 38 years old when I decided to spend a long weekend hunting alone in the woods near Minocqua, Wisconsin. It was mid-November, 2021. I'd been hunting for years, mostly with my cousin or a buddy from work. But this time, I needed some space. My wife and I had been arguing over small things that added up, and I just needed to clear my head. I figured a quiet few days in the woods, with nothing but the cold and the trees, would help. It always had. My plan was simple. I'd drive up on a Thursday, hike into the woods where my uncle used to take me as a teenager, and stay in the old hunting cabin he left behind when he passed away. I'd stay until Sunday afternoon, just me, my .308 rifle, and a cooler full of food and beer. The cabin wasn't much. It was a one-room shack with a rusty tin roof, sitting a good 6 miles from the nearest road, reachable only by an old logging trail that hadn't been maintained in years. It had a wood-burning stove, a rickety cot, and a steel door that didn't always close right. There was no cell service out there. You could wave your phone around all day, and it wouldn't find a single bar. That was part of the appeal. I packed the essentials in my truck early that Thursday morning. Sleeping bag, propane camp stove, cans of soup, instant coffee, 2 gallons of water, extra batteries, headlamp, knife, lighter, tarp, and a few beers for the evenings. I made sure to bring a decent amount of ammo and checked that my rifle was sighted in before leaving home. By the time I pulled off the county road and turned onto the narrow gravel path that led to the trailhead, the sky was starting to dim. I parked the truck under some pine cover and locked everything up. From there, I hiked in with a 40-pound pack and my rifle slung across my shoulder. The hike took about an hour and a half. The air was sharp, filled with the smell of dry leaves and frozen soil. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but you could tell it wasn't far off. The forest was quiet, too quiet in that heavy kind of way where every step you take crunches like thunder. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, I felt that little rush I always got. The roof had more rust than I remembered, and the wood siding looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of anything since my uncle died. But it still stood. I unlocked the door, shoved it open with my shoulder, and set down my gear. Dust hung in the air. A family of mice had clearly made themselves at home in one corner, but otherwise, it looked like it had the last time I saw it. Cold, empty, and waiting. I spent the rest of the evening sweeping, stacking wood inside, and lighting a fire in the stove. The inside warmed up fast once the flames got going. I heated up a can of soup, cracked open a beer, and sat on the cot in long underwear and wool socks, staring at the ceiling. No wife, no bills, no traffic. Just me and the forest. I fell asleep early, listening to the wind. The next morning, I was up before the sun. I drank instant coffee that tasted like chemicals, ate a granola bar, and headed out into the woods with my rifle. I'd staked out a small blind about a quarter-mile south of the cabin years ago, just a low wall of fallen logs with a good view of a game trail. I sat there most of the morning, saw a few deer tracks, but no movement. I stayed quiet, listened to the forest. Around noon, I headed back, made lunch, and rested a bit before going out again in the afternoon. Still nothing. The second night, it started snowing lightly. The wind picked up, and the temperature dropped fast. I stoked the fire before bed and put my boots near the stove so they'd be warm in the morning. As I lay in the cot, I heard something outside. First, I thought it was the wind, but it didn't sound like wind. It was faint, slow, crunching steps in the leaves or the thin crust of snow. I sat up quietly and held my breath. The steps paused, then continued. Maybe a deer, I thought, or a bear, though they'd usually be hibernating by now. I slipped out of my sleeping bag, grabbed the rifle, and moved to the door. I didn't open it. I just listened. Nothing. I waited another 5 minutes. Still nothing. I chalked it up to the wind playing tricks on me and went back to bed. The next morning, I found tracks outside. They weren't deer. They were boots. Someone had been walking around the cabin during the night. The tracks came from the trees, circled the cabin, then went off east, deeper into the woods. They were shallow prints, not deep enough to be from a heavy person, and they looked fairly recent, maybe from a few hours before sunrise. My first thought was that maybe someone else was out here hunting, but I hadn't seen another truck at the trailhead, and this cabin was far off any trail. You wouldn't just stumble onto it unless you knew where to look. That day, I stayed near the cabin. I didn't go out to hunt. I kept the rifle loaded and close. Every time a squirrel darted across the leaves or a tree branch snapped, I jumped. Around mid-afternoon, I took a walk in a small loop around the cabin, looking for more tracks. I found none. That night, I locked the door as best I could and pushed the cot against it. I barely slept. Every sound made me hold my breath. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The crunch of snow. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. And then tapping. Not on the door. On the wall. 3 soft taps, then silence. I stayed in bed, holding the rifle across my chest, staring into the dark, listening. Nothing followed. Just the wind again. When daylight came, I checked outside. More boot prints. Same size. They came from the trees again and led right up to the wall by the stove, then disappeared back into the woods. Whoever it was hadn't tried to break in. They hadn't left anything. They just walked up and tapped the wall. For what? A joke? A threat? I made the decision right then to pack up and head out early. Screw the last night. I could be home by evening. I boiled water for coffee, shoved everything into my pack, and opened the door just as the wind shifted. More tracks, fresh ones. This time there were 2 sets of boot prints. They weren't from last night. They hadn't been there earlier when I checked. These were newer. One set was coming toward the cabin, the other going away, both from the same direction as before. The prints were tight together, as if whoever made them had been walking slowly, carefully, watching. I stepped back inside, heart pounding, and shut the door. I didn't have a phone signal, but I carried a GPS beacon with an SOS feature. It wasn't meant for this kind of thing, usually for injuries or if you got lost, but I activated it. The signal would go out by satellite. I didn't know how long it would take for someone to respond, or if anyone would at all, but it was the only option I had. I wasn't about to hike 6 miles with 2 strangers possibly nearby and no clue what they wanted. I stayed in the cabin all day, rifle across my knees, waiting. At some point in the late afternoon, I heard a helicopter, just faintly in the distance. I ran outside and waved my orange vest like a lunatic. The helicopter passed overhead, circled once, then hovered briefly over the clearing near the cabin. I saw someone in the side door wave back. An hour later, a pair of forest rangers arrived on foot. I nearly cried when I saw them. They walked me out, both of them armed. As we moved along the trail, one of them mentioned that 2 men had been reported missing in the area 2 weeks ago. Poachers, probably, known to be dangerous, not local. Their truck had been found burned near a trail about 10 miles from here. When we got back to my vehicle, they told me not to return to the cabin for a while. They'd sweep the area and post signs, but honestly, they said, there were too many miles of forest to patrol every inch. If someone didn't want to be found out here, chances were they wouldn't be. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I still hunt, but never alone now, and never that deep in the woods. Not because I'm afraid of animals, not because I'm afraid of getting lost, but because somewhere out there are people who walk in circles around cabins. People who don't speak, don't steal, don't break in, but just stand in the dark, waiting. And I don't ever want to find out what they were waiting for. I was 32 when I decided I needed to step away from things for a while. My life had been spiraling slowly for a few years. Nothing dramatic, no big crash or explosion, just a slow decay of energy and drive. I was tired of the city. The noise, the pressure, the lights that never shut off, and the constant hum of things moving too fast. My job at a plumbing supply company had me stuck behind a desk for 9 hours a day. Every weekend bled into the next. I barely talked to anyone anymore. Felt like I was wearing someone else's skin. That fall, I took a month off work, cashed out some vacation time, and drove out to a farm property my uncle had left me after he passed. I hadn't been there since I was a kid. It sat out in northeast Iowa, way off the main roads, about 20 miles outside Decorah. My uncle used to grow corn and keep a few cows, but by the time he died, the place was mostly empty. I remembered the fields being big and open, and the cabin he built himself back in the 80s still stood at the edge of the woods. It wasn't big, just a one-room place with a tiny bathroom and a rusted-out generator for power. I figured it'd be the perfect spot to shut everything out for a while. I got there in early October. The trees were already starting to turn, and the wind had that sharp smell in it that told you winter wasn't far off. The gravel road leading in was worse than I remembered. Deep ruts and washouts forced me to crawl my old Subaru along at walking speed. When I finally broke out of the tree line and saw the cabin sitting there in the middle of a clearing, I felt a kind of relief I hadn't felt in years. No cell towers, no cars, just wind in the trees and the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. The first couple days were spent cleaning the place up. It had been sitting for years, and dust coated everything. There were mouse droppings in the drawers, spider webs in every corner, and a faint sour smell that never really went away. But it was solid. The roof didn't leak. The propane stove worked. The generator, after I cleaned the fuel lines, chugged to life on the third pull. I brought in a bunch of supplies from town, loaded the cooler with ice and groceries, and set myself up for a few quiet weeks. For the first week, it was exactly what I needed. I spent the days walking the woods, chopping deadfall for the fire, reading old paperbacks I'd brought, and sitting outside with a mug of coffee while the sun went down. I slept better than I had in years. No traffic outside my window, no neighbors arguing through the walls, just the sounds of wind and distant animals. But around day 10, something shifted. Started small, the kind of things you barely notice at first. I woke up one morning and found a set of boot prints in the dirt behind the cabin. I figured they were mine, but they looked too fresh. The dew hadn't even dried yet. Still, I brushed it off. The mind plays tricks, especially when it's been rewiring itself from overstimulation. I told myself I probably walked around there the night before and just forgot. Then I started noticing small changes around the property. I'd stack wood one way, and the next day it'd be slightly off. Not in a big way, just shifted enough that I knew I hadn't done it. One morning, I found the lid to the generator fuel can open. I always closed it tight out of habit. Another morning, a chunk of deer meat I'd left hanging to dry was gone, and the hook it was on was swinging slightly. I told myself a coyote or raccoon probably got it, but there were no drag marks.
No fur, no prints.
The closest neighbor was probably 5 miles away through thick timber and rolling hills. There weren't even power lines that far out. If someone was wandering around my cabin, they were either lost, drunk, or they meant to be there. By the end of the second week, I started keeping my shotgun nearby. It wasn't loaded, just a comfort thing at first. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, but something didn't feel right. I started checking the doors twice before bed, locking the windows even though I didn't think I needed to. I slept lighter, waking up at the smallest sound outside. One night, around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the porch. I was awake already, lying in bed with my eyes closed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. When I heard the boards creak under someone's weight, I froze. The kind of freeze where you hold your breath, afraid even your heartbeat will give you away. They weren't heavy steps, slow, one at a time, maybe 2 or 3 paces, then nothing. I reached out and grabbed the shotgun, keeping still. I didn't move for almost 20 minutes. I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps leaving, no animal sounds, just that deafening silence. I finally worked up the nerve to get up and look out the window, but the porch was empty. Still, I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I found a small scratch on the cabin door. It was shallow, maybe 2 inches long, like someone had dragged a nail or a knife tip across the wood. That's when I finally loaded the shotgun. I kept it next to the bed after that. Over the next few days, things escalated. I set up some tripwire around the back trail that led through the woods. Nothing dangerous, just an old fishing line tied between trees that would snap if something big enough passed through. 3 times I found it broken in the morning. No wind could have done that.
No falling branches.
Something or someone was moving around out there at night. On the 19th day, I went to check one of the old storage sheds near the edge of the clearing. It had been locked since I got there, and I hadn't bothered to open it until then. When I cut the padlock and pulled the door open, I found a pile of old tools, a rusted push mower, some plastic sheeting, and a crate of jars filled with cloudy liquid. But what made me pause was a section of dirt in the corner that looked freshly disturbed. Not obvious, just slightly higher than the rest of the floor. I grabbed a shovel and poked at it. About 2 feet down, I hit something solid. It was an old oil drum, half buried, with the lid loosely sitting on top. When I pried it open, the smell hit me first. Acrid, foul, like old meat and chemicals. Inside were scraps of stained cloth, some bones, small ones probably animal, and something that looked like a plastic doll's head. But when I looked closer, it wasn't plastic. It was too realistic. The skin texture, the hair. I dropped the lid and stumbled back, almost throwing up. I don't know if it was human. I didn't want to know. I covered it back up, locked the shed again, and walked straight back to the cabin. I packed a small bag, grabbed the shotgun, and loaded it fully. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I went to leave. That's when I noticed the tires on my Subaru had been slashed. All 4. Clean cuts. Not a blowout. Not age. Straight knife slashes. Deep. I stood there for a long time, staring at the car. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone for days. Whoever was out there had been watching me, waiting. There was no cell service out there. I'd been fine without it before, but now I was stranded. Town was a 20-mile walk through rough woods. I didn't trust the gravel road, too exposed, too open. I knew I had to cut through the timber. I left around noon, armed and moving fast. I didn't pack much, just water, a flashlight, some protein bars, and the gun. The trees were thick, and the trail was barely more than a game path. I kept hearing things, snaps, rustles, things moving just out of sight. I never saw anything, but I knew I was being followed. I could feel it. Every time I stopped, the forest seemed to breathe around me. Birds went silent. Squirrels froze on branches. Once, I caught a shape moving behind a log 50 yards away, but it slipped out of sight too fast to make out. By sunset, I was still 10 miles out. I decided to find high ground and make camp. I picked a rocky hill with a view down the valley and hunkered under a tree, shotgun across my lap. I didn't light a fire. I didn't eat. I sat in the dark, listening. I heard movement on and off through the night. Dry leaves crunching, a twig breaking, but nothing got close. When dawn broke, I moved again. My legs were shaking. I hadn't slept. I hadn't eaten. I kept moving, driven by pure fear. By noon, I finally hit the edge of the forest and saw the highway beyond the fence line. I staggered down the embankment, flagged down a delivery truck, and begged the driver to take me to town. He didn't ask questions, just nodded and let me in the cab. I reported everything to the sheriff's office. They sent a couple deputies out to the cabin. They found the oil drum. They found the slashed tires. They also found signs of someone else living in the woods nearby. An old tent, rotting food, a pile of used clothes, and a butchered deer carcass hung in the trees. But no person. They never caught anyone. I sold the land 6 months later to some retired couple from Illinois. I didn't tell them everything, just said I wasn't the farming type and preferred the city after all. I never went back. I don't even look at pictures of the place anymore. Now and then, I still wake up at night. Sure, I hear footsteps on the porch again. But I live in an apartment on the 3rd floor now.
No porch.
No trees, just the sound of cars and sirens outside. And somehow, that feels safer. I was 34 that summer. It was early July 2019 when I booked a short stay in a quiet part of Cumbria, up near the Scottish border. The area was surrounded by wide open fields, small patches of woodland, and narrow roads that curved through the hills. The cabin I found wasn't anything luxurious, just an old stone-built place with a metal roof and a little chimney that leaned slightly to the left. I wanted somewhere silent. I was tired of traffic noise, voices, screens. My phone barely got signal there, and that was perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon. The air was still warm, but clouds had started forming. The road that led to the cabin was barely a road, more like a dirt path winding between stone walls and sheep paddocks. My car scraped bottom a few times, but it made it. The cabin stood alone on a hilltop, with nothing around it except tall grass and one lone tree off to the east, bent sideways by the wind. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, made a sandwich, and sat on the front steps with a beer in my hand, watching the sky darken. It was so quiet that even the wind sounded heavy. The hills rolled on forever, empty and slow, and the last of the light just faded into that kind of blue-gray where you stop being able to see any detail. I slept early and slept well. The second day, I walked the area. I brought a small map with footpaths marked in dotted lines. I followed one down the back of the hill, along a stream where I saw deer tracks in the mud and old wire fences fallen into themselves. Eventually, I reached a place where 3 stone walls met, like the remains of a ruined sheep pen. That's where I first saw her. At first, she looked like part of the field. She was standing far off, maybe 100 meters away, half hidden behind a line of old posts with rusted barbed wire. She wasn't moving, just standing still with one hand on the wire. Long coat, maybe green or gray, I couldn't tell at that distance. Her hair was dark, and she didn't move an inch. I thought maybe she was a local farmer checking her property line, so I didn't think much of it. I kept walking, but even after I was a good distance down the hill, I glanced back and she was still there, still in the same exact spot, still facing me. Back at the cabin, I tried not to let it bother me. People walk their land, especially in these rural places. There's always someone who owns the field you're walking past, even if it feels like the middle of nowhere. I ate, read a bit, and later in the evening, as I was heading out to use the outhouse behind the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the dirt behind the structure. Not shoe prints, bare feet. They were small, almost child-sized, but the toes looked wrong. Too long. The heel was sunken deep, like the person had stood still for a while. I looked around the area, checked the grass and the slope leading up to the path, but found nothing else. I told myself maybe they were just old prints, maybe distorted by the rain or the soil. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept listening for sounds that weren't there. Kept thinking I saw something shift outside the window when it was really just the wind in the grass. The third morning, I got up early and walked back down to the ruins. I don't know why. I guess I wanted to reassure myself that there was nothing strange going on. The woman wasn't there. The field was empty again, and it looked so ordinary in the daylight that I felt foolish for being on edge. But then I noticed the barbed wire. Where she'd been standing, where her hand had rested, there was blood. Just a little, maybe from where she'd grabbed the rusted wire too hard. I looked closer. The barbs were fresh with a smear of red, and on one of the wooden posts, there were 3 long scratch marks, straight and parallel. Like claw marks, they were recent. I walked back fast. I didn't run, but I wanted to. I kept looking back over my shoulder and listening. Nothing, just sheep calls echoing in the far hills. That afternoon it rained. Not hard, but steady enough that I stayed inside. The cabin had one window that looked out over the back slope and the woods beyond. As the light faded, I stood there watching the mist come in over the hill, and she was there again, standing right at the edge of the field, just before the first tree line. Closer now, closer than before, maybe 50 meters, still not moving. Her coat looked soaked, hanging off her like a dead weight. Her hands hung low at her sides, and I saw now that one of them was wrapped in what looked like fabric, white stained red. She didn't come closer. She just stood there. I closed the curtain. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on and sat in the corner near the fireplace. I didn't hear anything. Nothing knocked. Nothing creaked more than usual. But when I finally worked up the nerve to look out the window again just after sunrise, she was gone. I told myself the cabin was probably on the edge of someone's property. Maybe a neighbor with a mental illness or just someone lonely. But something about the way she didn't move, something about how she just stared without blinking, if she even blinked, kept me from relaxing. By the 4th day, I was ready to leave. I packed up most of my stuff and loaded it in the car. I had one more night before the rental was over, but I didn't care. I planned to head out early the next morning. I left only a few things inside: some food, my toothbrush, a mug, just the essentials. That evening, just after the rain stopped, I decided to take a short walk to calm myself. I followed the same stream as before, but stayed closer to the cabin this time. I walked a small loop, maybe half an hour, and when I came back to the cabin, something felt off. I could smell something, a sort of sour, metallic smell like rust and earth. I walked around the cabin once. Nothing. Then I went around again. That's when I saw the fabric. It was a strip of white cloth tied to the door handle, soaked in red. I didn't touch it. I stepped back and looked around. Nothing moved in the grass. Nothing in the trees. I opened the door slowly. Inside, everything looked the same except the mug. It was sitting on the table, clean, empty. But I hadn't left it there. I'd left it on the shelf by the sink. And beside it, on the table, was a long strand of hair. Black, soaked, stuck to the wood like it had been dragged through water. I stood still for a long time. I kept the door open, one hand on the handle, ready to bolt if I heard anything. But I didn't. I didn't stay inside that night. I slept in the car, locked all the doors, pulled a blanket over myself, and left the engine off so I wouldn't waste fuel. I couldn't see the cabin from the car once it got dark, and that made it worse. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured her standing outside the window, just staring in. I must have slept a little, because when I opened my eyes again, it was dawn. Fog had rolled in and covered the fields in a thick white sheet. I started the car. I was done. I drove straight out, bouncing down the old dirt track until I hit the main road. The tires slipped in the wet grass, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just drove. I drove 2 hours south and booked a cheap hotel off the motorway. Something generic and bright with Wi-Fi and loud neighbors. I needed the noise. I didn't tell anyone. Not for a long time. Not until the police called me 6 months later. They found a body near the same cabin. A hiker had gone missing in early January, and after a long search, someone spotted torn clothing and bone fragments in the tree line just behind the field. Forensics confirmed it. Woman in her 20s, still unidentified. No head, no hands, just a coat, torn open, and a cloth wrapped around the wrist with traces of blood and hair. The cabin was sealed off. Investigation ongoing. That's what they told me. I asked them if there had been any reports before mine. They said no. I've thought about that a lot. Who she was, what she wanted, why she never came closer. I still don't know. But I think about that night I slept in the car, about what could have happened if I stayed inside, about what might have happened to the mug if I hadn't left it on the shelf instead of the table. And I think about the footprints, the hair, the fabric tied to my door like a marker, a warning. I don't go into the countryside anymore. I don't hike. I don't rent cabins. Sometimes I still wake up with the image of her standing in that field, soaking wet, one hand wrapped, the other hanging limp, waiting, but she never came for me. I don't know why, and I think that's the only reason I'm still alive. I was 32 when I decided to leave the city behind for a while. This was late December of 2022. I'd been working for nearly a decade at a mechanical engineering firm in Pittsburgh, and between the constant deadlines, noise, and daily grind, something in me just burned out. My girlfriend had just left me a month earlier. I didn't fight it. I think I understood why. I was becoming someone I didn't even like being around. So I took a leave of absence, packed up my gear, and drove out to a place my uncle used to own in the Appalachian foothills, right near the Pennsylvania-West Virginia border. It was remote, miles from the nearest road, surrounded by nothing but woods and ridges and the occasional crumbling hunting blind from another time. It was the kind of cabin that didn't have any electricity or running water, just a little stove, a cot, and some old canned goods that probably should have been thrown out a decade ago. I knew the area well enough from summers when I was a kid. My Uncle Mark had bought the place cheap in the 80s and used it as a hunting spot. After he died, the land just sat there. No one in the family really wanted it. I guess I figured I could use the silence, the cold air, and some time away from everyone. I packed light, some food, extra propane, a rifle just in case, a sleeping bag, and winter clothes. I parked my truck where the old logging road ended, hiked in 2 hours through fresh snow and bitter wind, and got there just before dusk. The cabin looked the same as I remembered it. Weather-beaten pine walls, moss on the roof, a little chimney that was still intact. There was a half-collapsed shed next to it and a rusted-out barrel that once held firewood. The door was stiff on its hinges but opened fine. The air inside was stale and dry. A few old beer cans, rat droppings in the corners, but nothing too bad. I aired it out, swept a bit, and started a fire in the stove. The first few nights were exactly what I'd hoped for. Dead quiet. No fones, no bus, no e-mails. I read old books by flashlight, made simple meals, sat outside during the day and just listened to the wind through the trees. At night, I kept the fire going, wore 3 layers, and stayed tucked in the sleeping bag. It got down to about 10 degrees most nights, colder when the wind picked up. I started waking up around 3 a.m. every night, which I figured was just part of being out there. My body wasn't used to the pitch-black dark and the silence. But even in that quiet, I began to notice faint sounds outside. At first, it was subtle, just creaking trees, snow shifting off branches. Then I heard crunching footsteps, more than once. I kept telling myself it was probably deer, maybe even a bear, though it was late in the season for that. Still, something about the way the steps came and stopped felt off. There was no real pattern, just the sound of weight pressing into the snow. Then silence. Sometimes it was close, sometimes further out. A few nights it happened right around 3:20 a.m. I started checking my watch. One night, I finally grabbed the rifle and stepped out onto the porch. It was around that time again, 3:20 or so. The fire was dying inside, and I'd been laying there listening to the same slow crunching. I stood on the porch with my breath fogging up in front of me, my boots on the frozen planks, and my hands cold on the rifle. Nothing moved at first, just the trees, and the wind hissing through the bare branches. Then I saw something about 20 yards out. A figure. It was hunched, not quite standing tall, moving slow across the slope behind the cabin. Not walking like a man, more like dragging a leg. The shape was thin, the head slightly cocked to the side. It moved in short bursts, stopping every few steps. I didn't call out. I didn't want to. I didn't want to hear anything back. Instead, I raised the rifle, not aiming directly, but just in case. The figure didn't turn or flinch. It kept on slowly moving through the trees, finally slipping out of sight behind a ridge. I stood out there for a long time after that, long enough that my toes went numb. Finally, I went back inside and stoked the fire again, sitting with my back against the wall and the rifle beside me. By morning, I convinced myself it was a hunter, someone trespassing, maybe drunk, maybe hurt. There were no fresh tracks by the time the sun came up, though, which made no sense. I even walked the slope where I'd seen it.
No prints.
Just wind-blown snow, smooth and unbroken. I didn't sleep the next night, or the one after that. On the fourth night, it got worse. I'd gone to bed early that evening. The cold was deep in my bones. Around 2:45 a.m., I heard something new. Not footsteps. It sounded like an animal, but not quite. Something shuffling in the snow. Then it made this strange throat sound, low, almost like someone trying to clear their throat, but deeper. Wet. I was fully awake then, heart racing. I sat up, gripped the rifle, and stared at the door. Then came the tapping. Not knocking. Tapping. Fingernails. Slow. Deliberate. Just one or two taps at a time. I couldn't tell if it was on the door or the sidewall. My stomach turned over. I waited. Then nothing. 15 minutes later, I opened the door and stepped out again.
No footprints.
No animal. Just dead stillness. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. The whole place felt different now. The air was heavier. Couldn't eat. I was too wired to relax. It wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt like being watched. Like someone was just beyond the trees, always there. I packed most of my gear and waited for first light. But just before sunrise, heavy snow started falling. Fast. The kind that blinds you in minutes. I knew I wouldn't be able to hike out in that. Not without risking getting lost or hurt. So I stayed one more day. Just one more. That day, I didn't go outside at all. I kept the fire going. I read, but I didn't absorb any of it. I sat facing the door, trying to calm myself down, telling myself nothing had happened, that it was just isolation playing tricks on me. That night, everything came to a head. It was cold, below zero by then. I wrapped up in my sleeping bag and coat and tried to shut my eyes. I must have dozed off around midnight. I woke up to the door slowly creaking open. Just the sound of old hinges, slow, groaning. I didn't move. I pretended I was still asleep, one hand under the sleeping bag clutching the rifle. The door creaked wider, inch by inch, then stopped. The cold rushed in. I felt it instantly on my face. Something stepped inside, light, almost careful. One step, then another, then it paused. I held my breath, eyes barely open. It stood there, right near the stove. I could barely see the outline in the faint glow from the firelight. It was taller than I expected. Not a deer, not a bear, not any animal, but not moving like a person either. Then it crouched. That motion, it bent down in this jagged, awkward way like it didn't know how knees worked. Put its hands near the coals in the stove, like it wanted the heat. I saw fingers, long, too long, dirty, nails blackened. It didn't say anything. It didn't breathe heavy. It just squatted there, warming its hands. I stayed still. My chest ached from holding my breath. My heart was hammering. I knew if I made a sound, I was done. It stayed there for minutes. Then it turned toward me, slow, like it sensed I was watching. Its head tilted in that same way I'd seen outside. Not curious, just wrong. I saw its face. It wasn't a face, really. It was human-like, but the features were off. Skin too pale, eyes too wide, mouth slightly open, showing teeth, but no expression. Just this blank, waiting look, like it didn't understand what it was supposed to be. Then it stood and walked backward. No turn,
No pivot.
just walked back, stiffly, and slipped out the door, which stayed open. I laid there another half hour before I moved. When I finally stood up, the snow was blowing hard outside. The figure was gone. No tracks again. By first light, the storm had eased just enough. I left everything behind except the rifle and my keys. I made that 2-hour hike in just over one. My legs ached. My lungs burned. I never looked behind me. I got to the truck, half buried in snow. Took another 30 minutes to dig it out and get it started. I didn't stop driving until I was back in Pittsburgh. It's been over a year since that winter. I haven't been back to the cabin. I don't plan to. I've told myself every version of the story there is. That it was a squatter, a hallucination, someone with a mental illness lost in the woods. But none of that explains what I saw. The movements, the silence, the fact that nothing left tracks, that it knew where I was sleeping. I've heard the word skinwalker thrown around, some Navajo legend or something, but I don't believe in that stuff. Not really. All I know is that something lived in those woods, something that watched, waited, and walked on 2 legs but wasn't quite a man. And I don't ever want to see it again.